Welcome to Eternal Darkness, where nightmares come to life. I'll be your host through these twisted tales tonight. Before we descend into the shadows, remember to like and subscribe to join our growing community of horror enthusiasts. Get comfortable, turn down the lights, and prepare yourself as we begin our journey into the unknown. Summer break had just begun, and the weight of 7th grade finally lifted from my shoulders. I was 13 that year, 2019, a time when most kids my age were glued to their phones or gaming consoles. Not me, though. My parents couldn't afford the latest technology, and our family vacations consisted of weekend trips to visit my grandmother 2 towns over. That's why when my best friend Samantha approached me with a glossy brochure for Camp Evergreen, I felt a surge of excitement I hadn't experienced in years. The brochure showcased smiling girls canoeing across a serene lake, hiking through lush forests, and gathering around crackling campfires. It looked like something straight out of a movie, nothing like the mundane summers I was used to. "My mom signed me up already," Samantha said, her eyes bright with anticipation. 2 full weeks. She said I could bring a friend, and I immediately thought of you. I stared at the pictures, tracing my finger over the pristine lake. Camp Evergreen was nestled in the mountains, approximately 3 hours from our hometown. The thought of being so far from home made my stomach twist with both excitement and apprehension. "I've never been away from home that long," I admitted, but couldn't hide my growing enthusiasm. "It'll be amazing," Samantha insisted. "We'll swim, hike, make new friends. Please say yes." That evening, I showed the brochure to my parents. To my surprise, they agreed almost immediately. My mother commented that it would be good for me to experience nature instead of spending another summer helping her around the house. My father seemed relieved at the prospect of one less mouth to feed for 2 weeks. They weren't being cruel. Money was just always tight. In the days leading up to our departure, I packed and repacked my duffel bag, checked items off the camp's recommended list, and tried to imagine what awaited me. I'd never been a particularly adventurous child. The closest I'd come to camping was sleeping in our backyard when the summer heat made our house unbearable. The night before we left, I had my first nightmare. I was swimming in dark water, unable to see more than a few inches in front of me. Something brushed against my leg, a cold, firm grip that pulled me deeper. I woke gasping for air, my sheets damp with sweat. I dismissed it as pre-camp jitters and didn't mention it to anyone. I should have recognized it for what it was: a warning. The journey to Camp Evergreen was filled with Samantha's excited chatter and her mother's occasional interjections about her own camp experiences from decades ago. I half listened, watching through the window as suburban landscapes gave way to increasingly dense forests and winding mountain roads. As we turned onto a gravel path marked with a wooden sign reading, "Camp Evergreen, Empowering Young Women," since 1972, I felt a peculiar sensation. The air seemed to thicken, and the lush trees lining the entrance cast long shadows across our path. The sun, bright and cheerful throughout our drive, now struggled to penetrate the dense canopy above. "We're here!" Samantha squealed, pressing her face against the window as a cluster of rustic cabins came into view. The main lodge was a massive log structure with a wraparound porch where several adults in forest green polo shirts stood welcoming arrivals. Beyond it, I could see glimpses of the lake, its surface reflecting the afternoon light like a mirror. As we exited the car, the first thing that struck me was the silence. Despite dozens of girls and parents milling about, there was an unnatural stillness to the place. No birds sang in the trees, no insects buzzed. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath. "Welcome to Camp Evergreen." A woman with a clipboard approached us, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "I'm Ms. Winters, the camp director." Ms. Winters had the weathered look of someone who spent most of her time outdoors: tanned skin, crow's feet around her eyes, and calloused hands. She checked our names off her list and assigned us to Cabin Pine, explaining that we'd meet our counselor at orientation. You girls are in for a special summer, she said, her voice dropping slightly. We have many exciting activities planned. Samantha's mother helped us carry our bags to our cabin, hugged us both tightly, and promised to return in 2 weeks. As her car disappeared down the gravel road, I felt a twinge of unease. I was now farther from home than I'd ever been, surrounded by strangers in an unfamiliar place. Cabin Pine was rustic but comfortable, with 6 bunk beds, a small bathroom, and wooden chests for our belongings. 4 other girls were already unpacking. Twins named Hannah and Haley, a tall girl called Brianna, and a quiet, intense-looking girl named Josephine. I heard they renovated all the cabins after what happened, Josephine said abruptly as she shoved clothes into a drawer. After what? I asked, selecting a bottom bunk near the window. Josephine looked around as if checking for eavesdroppers. You don't know? About the drowning? Before she could continue, the cabin door swung open and our counselor strode in. Iris was in her early 20s, with a perpetual smile and boundless energy. She clapped her hands to get our attention. Welcome to Cabin Pine. Let's save the ghost stories for the campfire, shall we? She gave Josephine a pointed look. Orientation begins in 15 minutes at the main lodge. Don't be late. As we followed Iris to the main lodge, Samantha nudged me. Don't let Josephine freak you out. Every camp has some story to scare the new kids. I nodded, but couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to Josephine's comment. The way our counselor had so quickly shut down the conversation seemed strange. What was the drowning she'd mentioned? And why did it necessitate cabin renovations? Orientation was a blur of rules, schedules, and introductions. We learned about the camp's history, founded by a woman who believed girls needed wilderness experiences to build character, the daily routine, wake at 7 a.m., lights out at 10 p.m., and the various activities available: swimming, canoeing, hiking, archery, crafts. Throughout the presentation, I found my attention drawn to the large windows overlooking the lake. The water was unnaturally still, a dark blue surface that reflected the surrounding trees like a perfect photograph. As the sun began to set, the lake's color deepened to an almost black hue. That lake gives me the creeps, Brianna whispered beside me. It's too quiet. She was right. Most lakes I'd seen had small waves, ripples from fish jumping, or water bugs skittering across the surface. This one was completely motionless, as if frozen in time. After orientation, we returned to our cabin for get-to-know-you games led by Iris. As we sat in a circle on the wooden floor, sharing facts about ourselves, I noticed Josephine's eyes repeatedly drifting to the window facing the lake. When we finally crawled into our bunks that night, exhausted from the long day, I heard Josephine whispering from her bed across the room. Her name was Andrea Walsh, she said, barely audible. She drowned here in 1996. They never found her body. I pulled my blanket tighter around me, trying to block out her words, but sleep remained elusive for hours. When I finally drifted off, my dreams were filled with dark water and reaching hands. Morning arrived with the blaring of a bugle across the campgrounds. I blinked awake, momentarily disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings. Sunlight streamed through the cabin windows, casting warm patterns on the wooden floor. For a moment, the previous night's unease seemed foolish in the bright light of day. Iris herded us to the dining hall, a spacious building with long wooden tables and benches. The air was filled with the scent of bacon and pancakes and the chatter of nearly 100 excited girls. Samantha and I filled our trays and found seats at a table with girls from Cabin Birch. Have you heard about the ghost? A freckled girl named Grace asked as she slid onto the bench across from us. Josephine mentioned something about a drowning, I admitted, keeping my voice low. Grace nodded eagerly. Andrea Walsh. She was our age, 13, when it happened. They say she went swimming alone at night, against the rules, obviously. The next morning, they found her clothes on the dock, but no Andrea. That's not what I heard, another girl interjected. I heard she was pushed by her counselor. That's ridiculous, Samantha said with an eye roll. If a counselor murdered a camper, the place would have been shut down. Not if they covered it up, Grace countered. My older sister came here 3 years ago. She said they don't let anyone swim in the deep part of the lake anymore. They've got buoys marking it off limits. I glanced out the window at the lake, visible in the distance. The morning sun glinted off its surface, making it appear almost inviting. It was hard to reconcile the beautiful scene with such a tragic story. Whatever happened, it was over 20 years ago, Samantha said firmly. I'm not letting some old story ruin my summer. After breakfast, our cabin group was scheduled for swimming lessons. We changed into our swimsuits and made our way down to the lake, where Iris and another counselor named Maya waited on the dock with clipboards. Up close, the lake was even more beautiful and more unsettling. The water was incredibly clear near the shore, allowing visibility several feet down to the sandy bottom. Further out, however, it darkened rapidly, the bottom disappearing into blackness. The swimming area is marked by the yellow buoys, Iris explained, pointing to a roped-off section of the lake. Beyond that, the lake drops off quickly to over 30 feet deep. No one swims past the buoys, ever. Understood? We all nodded solemnly. I couldn't help noticing how the other counselor, Maya, stared out at the deep water with an expression I couldn't quite decipher. Something between fear and reverence. After assessing our swimming abilities, we were divided into groups. Being a strong swimmer, I was placed in the advanced group with Samantha, Brianna, and several girls from other cabins. We practiced strokes while Iris watched from the dock, occasionally shouting instructions. The water was surprisingly warm for a mountain lake, almost unnaturally so. As I swam, I noticed how sound seemed to behave strangely underwater, muffled in a way that felt different from my experiences in public pools or the rare occasions I'd been to the beach. About 20 minutes into our lesson, I dove under to practice retrieving objects from the bottom. The counselors had tossed several colorful rings for us to retrieve. I spotted a red one near the boundary rope and swam toward it. As I reached for the ring, a shadow passed overhead, something large moving across the surface. Thinking it was another swimmer, I surfaced quickly, not wanting a collision. But when my head broke the water, I saw all the other girls still in their designated areas, none close enough to have cast the shadow I'd seen. The counselors remained on the dock, engaged in conversation. I treaded water, scanning the lake's surface. Nothing unusual was visible, yet I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The back of my neck prickled with goosebumps despite the warm water. "Everything okay?" Samantha called from a few yards away. "Yeah," I replied automatically, though nothing felt okay. "Just thought I saw something." I returned to the group, but kept glancing back at the spot where I'd seen the shadow. For the remainder of the swimming lesson, I stayed in the shallowest part of the designated area, never letting my feet lose contact with the bottom. Later that afternoon, during free time, I sat on the cabin's small porch with my journal, trying to rationalize what I'd experienced. Perhaps it had been a large fish, or a shadow from a passing cloud. The rational explanations didn't ease my discomfort. Josephine emerged from the cabin and sat beside me, her dark eyes studying my face with uncomfortable intensity. "You felt it, didn't you?" she asked quietly. "In the lake." I hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. Felt what? That we're not alone in there. Josephine hugged her knees to her chest. My older sister came here 4 years ago. She told me about Andrea. Said the lake changed after she drowned, became warmer, quieter, like something's absorbing all the energy. "It's just a lake," I said, not believing my own words. Josephine gave me a sad smile. Andrea's family demanded an investigation after she disappeared. The police brought in divers, sonar equipment, everything. They never found a trace of her. It's like the lake just swallowed her. People are found eventually, I argued. Bodies float. Not in Evergreen Lake, Josephine whispered. Nothing that goes into the deep part ever comes back up. Before I could respond, Iris called us for the next activity. As I stood to leave, Josephine grabbed my wrist, her fingers digging into my skin with surprising strength. "Stay away from the deep water," she warned. Andrea isn't the only one who never came back. The next few days passed in a blur of scheduled activities, new friendships, and forced normalcy. I threw myself into camp life, determined to enjoy the experience despite the unease that lingered at the edges of my consciousness. Samantha, oblivious to my concerns, thrived in the environment, quickly becoming a favorite among counselors for her enthusiasm and leadership qualities. Our third day at camp brought our cabin's turn for canoeing lessons. After breakfast, we gathered at the boathouse, a weathered structure extending partly over the water. Inside, rows of canoes hung from the ceiling, their hulls gleaming with fresh varnish. "Today, you'll learn basic paddling techniques and water safety," explained Mr. Harmon, the elderly caretaker who ran the boating program. His leathery skin and calloused hands spoke of decades spent outdoors. "Each of you will take a canoe out. Follow my instructions carefully." We were fitted with life jackets and given paddles. One by one, we climbed into canoes while Mr. Harmon and Iris steadied them against the dock. When my turn came, I hesitated, staring down at the water lapping against the wooden structure. "Something wrong?" Mr. Harmon asked, noticing my reluctance. "No," I lied, forcing myself to step into the narrow vessel. It wobbled beneath me, and I gripped the sides with white knuckles. "That's it," he encouraged as I settled onto the seat. "Keep your weight centered." He pushed my canoe away from the dock with surprising strength for his age. I dipped my paddle into the water as he demonstrated, making small, controlled strokes. The canoe glided smoothly across the surface, joining the others who were already practicing in a small cove near the boathouse. For several minutes, I felt a growing confidence. The repetitive motion of paddling was almost meditative, and the morning sun warmed my skin pleasantly. Perhaps I had been overthinking things. Perhaps the stories about Andrea Walsh were just that. Stories. Then I noticed I'd drifted away from the group. Despite maintaining what I thought was a straight course, my canoe had somehow veered toward the center of the lake, past the swimming buoys that marked the drop-off to deeper water. I corrected my course, digging my paddle deeper to turn back toward the cove. The canoe didn't respond as expected. Instead of turning, it continued its path toward deeper water, as if pulled by an invisible current. I paddled harder, my arms burning with the effort, yet made no progress toward the shore. "You're too far out," Iris called from the dock, her voice carrying across the water. "Turn back toward the cove." "I'm trying," I shouted back, fighting against the inexplicable pull. Mr. Harmon quickly launched another canoe, powerful strokes carrying him toward me. As he approached, my canoe suddenly lurched to one side, nearly capsizing. I dropped my paddle in surprise and grabbed the gunnels to steady myself. The paddle didn't float as it should have. Instead, it sank immediately, disappearing into the darkness below. As I watched it vanish, something in the depths caught my eye. A pale shape, moving against the blackness. Not the random movement of underwater currents, but the deliberate motion of something swimming. Something large. My heart hammered against my ribs as I stared into the water. The shape moved closer to the surface, growing more distinct. A face, human yet somehow wrong, materialized beneath my canoe. Pale, bloated features distorted by water and time, with dark holes where eyes should be. A mouth opened in what could have been a smile or a scream. I recoiled so violently that the canoe rocked dangerously. Water splashed over the sides, soaking my legs. The face disappeared as suddenly as it had appeared, leaving only the dark water below. Mr. Harmon reached me moments later, expertly maneuvering his canoe alongside mine. "Grab my paddle," he instructed, extending it toward me. "I'll tow you back." With trembling hands, I clutched the offered paddle. Mr. Harmon began rowing us both toward shore, his weathered face set in a grim expression. "Did you see something in the water?" he asked quietly, his eyes scanning the lake's surface. I hesitated. Would he believe me? Would anyone? I thought I saw a face. His paddling faltered for just a moment before resuming its steady rhythm. "The sun plays tricks on these waters," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "Reflections, shadows, easy to see things that aren't there." But his eyes told a different story. They held knowledge, perhaps fear. He knew something about this lake that he wasn't sharing. Back on shore, Iris wrapped a towel around my shoulders, mistaking my shaking for cold rather than terror. "You drifted into the current," she explained, rubbing my arms briskly. "It happens sometimes. That's why we always stay in the cove for lessons." "What current?" Samantha asked, standing nearby with the others. "The lake looks perfectly still." "Underwater currents," Mr. Harmon interjected. "This lake has unusual hydrology. Underground springs create currents you can't see from the surface." The explanation sounded rehearsed, as if he'd given it many times before. The other girls accepted it without question, but I knew what I'd seen. No current had pulled my canoe. Something had wanted me in the deep water. That night I lay awake long after lights out, listening to the steady breathing of my cabin mates. My mind replayed the face I'd seen, the hollow eyes, the grotesque smile. Was it Andrea Walsh? Or something else entirely? Around midnight, I heard soft footsteps on the wooden floor. Peeking through barely opened eyes, I saw Josephine slip out the cabin door. Curiosity overrode my fear, and I quietly followed, grabbing a flashlight from beside my bunk. The night was moonless, the camp illuminated only by a few security lights along the main paths. I caught a glimpse of Josephine's silhouette heading toward the lake and followed at a distance, careful to avoid twigs and other noisy debris on the ground. She stopped at the edge of the dock, gazing out over the water. I hid behind a nearby tree, watching as she knelt and placed something on the wooden planks. Flowers, I realized. A small bouquet of wildflowers gathered from around the camp. "I know you're there," Josephine said suddenly without turning around. "You can come out." Startled, I stepped from my hiding place. "What are you doing?" "Paying respects," she replied simply. "Andrea's birthday was yesterday. She would have been 36. I approached cautiously, standing beside her on the dock. The lake before us was a vast expanse of blackness, not even stars reflected on its unusually still surface. "How do you know so much about her?" I asked. Josephine was quiet for a long moment. "Andrea was my aunt. My mother's younger sister." The revelation struck me speechless. This wasn't just camp folklore to her. It was family history, personal tragedy. "My mother never got over it," Josephine continued. "She visits the lake every year on Andrea's birthday. This year she couldn't come, so I promised I'd leave flowers for her." "I'm sorry," I said inadequately. "About your aunt." "They said she drowned accidentally." Josephine's voice hardened. "But my mother never believed it. Andrea was an excellent swimmer, and she wasn't alone that night." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. "What do you mean?" "She was with her counselor, Ms. Winters." The name hit me like a physical blow. "The camp director? She was here when it happened?" Josephine nodded. "She was Andrea's counselor that summer. The police questioned her, but she claimed Andrea snuck out alone after lights out. No one could prove otherwise." My mind raced, connecting pieces of a puzzle I hadn't known existed. Ms. Winters's strange demeanor, the way the counselors avoided discussing the lake's history, Mr. Harmon's practiced explanation of underwater currents. I saw something in the lake today, I admitted, the words tumbling out before I could reconsider. A face under my canoe. Josephine didn't seem surprised. Others have seen her too. The camp covers it up, calls them hallucinations or tricks of light, but I know better. What really happened to her? I asked, dreading the answer. I don't know for certain, Josephine replied. But I intend to find out before camp ends, and I think you're meant to help me. As if in response to her words, the still surface of the lake suddenly rippled. A single, perfect circle expanding outward from a central point, as if something large had risen briefly before sinking again into the depths. We both took an involuntary step back from the edge. Something's happening, Josephine whispered. The lake is changing. Andrea's getting stronger. What do you mean, stronger? Every year there are more sightings, more incidents. Last summer, a girl nearly drowned during a night swim. Said something grabbed her ankle and wouldn't let go. I thought of my canoe being pulled toward deeper water against all my efforts to turn back. We should tell someone. Who? Ms. Winters? The counselors? They're all part of it. Josephine gathered her flashlight. Meet me tomorrow night after lights out. Bring your swimsuit. My swimsuit? Why would I? We're going to find proof, she interrupted. In the boathouse, there are records there, logs from every summer, including 1996. As we crept back to our cabin, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, not just by whoever might be patrolling the grounds, but by something else. Something that dwelled in the unnaturally still waters of Evergreen Lake and had been waiting patiently for 23 years. The following day passed with excruciating slowness. Every activity, every meal, every conversation seemed to drag on endlessly as I waited for nightfall. I went through the motions of camp life mechanically, my mind preoccupied with what Josephine had shared and what we planned to do. Samantha noticed my distraction during archery practice. Are you still freaked out about yesterday? She asked as we retrieved arrows from the target. Mr. Harmon said it was just underwater currents. I'm fine, I lied. Just tired. Didn't sleep well. Is it Josephine? She's been glued to your side since yesterday. Samantha lowered her voice. The twins told me she comes here every summer but never makes friends. They think she's obsessed with that drowning story because she's related to the girl who died. She told me, I admitted. Andrea was her aunt. Samantha's eyes widened. Seriously? That's morbid. Why would her parents keep sending her to the camp where her aunt died? It was a good question, one I hadn't considered. Maybe they don't know she's investigating what happened. Investigating? What are you talking about? I realized I'd said too much and quickly backpedaled. Nothing, just that she's curious about it. Samantha studied my face for a moment, then shook her head. Whatever she's dragged you into, be careful. The counselors already watch her like a hawk. You don't want that kind of attention. Her warning stayed with me throughout the day. I noticed for the first time how the counselors did indeed seem to track Josephine's movements more closely than the other campers. During swimming, Iris remained unnervingly close to her in the water. At lunch, Maya happened to sit at our table. During free time, there always seemed to be a staff member nearby when Josephine was around. Were they watching her because they knew about her connection to Andrea? Or because they feared what she might discover? After dinner, as we walked back to our cabin, I pulled Josephine aside. We're being watched, I whispered. The counselors are always around you. Now you're noticing, she replied with a grim smile. It's been like this every summer since I started coming here 3 years ago. They know who I am. Then why do you keep coming back? Josephine's expression darkened. Because every year I get closer to the truth. Last summer I found Andrea's name in an old registry in the main office. It had been crossed out, not just lined through, but violently scribbled over until the page tore. "And your parents just let you come back after what happened to your aunt?" "They don't know," she admitted. "They think I'm at a science camp in Springfield. My grandmother helps me. She never believed the accident story either." The depths of Josephine's deception stunned me. She had orchestrated an elaborate lie, maintained year after year, all to investigate her aunt's disappearance. Her determination was both admirable and frightening. "What do you think happened to her?" I asked. Josephine glanced around before answering, ensuring no one was within earshot. "I think Ms. Winters was involved. Maybe it was an accident, maybe not. But I know she lied about Andrea being alone that night." "How can you be sure?" "Because I found a photograph in the camp archives last summer. It showed Andrea with Ms. Winters on the dock, time-stamped 11:43 p.m., the night she disappeared." The revelation sent a chill through me. If Josephine was right, the camp director had lied to police and potentially covered up a death, possibly even murder. "The picture disappeared the next day," Josephine continued. "I went back to look at it again, and it was gone. That's when they started watching me more closely." That night, as the cabin settled into sleep, I lay awake, listening for Josephine's signal. Around midnight, I heard 3 soft taps on the wooden post beside my bunk, our agreed-upon code. I slipped out of bed, already dressed in shorts and a t-shirt over my swimsuit as Josephine had instructed. She waited by the door, a small backpack slung over her shoulder. We crept out silently, careful not to wake the others. The camp was eerily quiet. Even the usual chorus of frogs and crickets seemed subdued, as if the wildlife sensed something unnatural about this place. We moved from shadow to shadow, avoiding the security lights that illuminated the main paths. The boathouse loomed ahead, a dark silhouette against the starry sky. Unlike the rest of the camp buildings, it extended partly over the water, built on thick wooden pillars sunk deep into the lakebed. During the day, it was a hub of activity. At night, it transformed into something foreboding. "There's a side door that's never locked," Josephine whispered as we approached. "The caretaker is forgetful." Sure enough, the small maintenance entrance swung open with minimal creaking when she pushed it. We slipped inside, closing it carefully behind us. The interior was pitch black. Josephine switched on a small flashlight, keeping its beam pointed downward to minimize the chance of being spotted from outside. The weak light revealed rows of canoes and kayaks hanging from the ceiling, creating strange, elongated shadows on the walls. "The office is this way," she murmured, leading me past equipment racks toward a small room at the back. The office was little more than a closet with a desk and filing cabinet. Josephine handed me the flashlight and began rifling through the drawers with practiced efficiency. "What exactly are we looking for?" I asked, nervously scanning the boathouse for any sign of movement. "Incident reports, logbooks from 1996, anything about Andrea." She pulled out a dusty ledger. "Hold the light steady." As she flipped through the yellowed pages, I noticed something unusual. Water was seeping under the door, not from the direction of the lake, but from the main boathouse area we'd just passed through. "Josephine," I whispered urgently. "There's water coming in." She glanced down, frowning at the thin line of moisture advancing across the floor. "That's not possible. The boathouse is watertight." We both stared as the water continued to spread, soaking into the thin carpet. It didn't behave like normal water. It moved with purpose, seeming to reach toward us rather than simply flowing downhill. "We need to leave," I said, backing away until I hit the desk. "Now." Josephine shoved the ledger into her backpack. "Not yet. I found something." She pointed to an entry dated July 17, 1996. "Look." The page detailed a water safety incident involving camper AW and counselor CW. It was vague, mentioning only that both had been out after curfew and that appropriate disciplinary measures were implemented. CW, I read aloud. Catherine Winters? Josephine nodded grimly. This proves they were together that night. But there's something strange about this entry. It's dated July 17th. But my mother always said Andrea disappeared on July 15th. Before I could process this discrepancy, a loud splash came from the main area of the boathouse. Not the gentle lapping of the lake against the pillars, but the distinctive sound of something large emerging from water. We froze, eyes locked on the door as water continued to seep underneath, now nearly an inch deep in the small office. "Someone's out there," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "Not someone," Josephine corrected, her face pale in the flashlight's glow. "Something." A heavy, wet sound, like sodden footsteps, moved across the boathouse floor, approaching the office. The doorknob turned slowly, metal grinding against metal. Josephine reacted first, grabbing my arm and pulling me toward a small window on the back wall. "Out! Now!" She pushed the window open and helped boost me through. I tumbled onto the narrow maintenance walkway that ran along the boathouse exterior, just a few feet above the water. Josephine followed seconds later, pulling the window closed behind her. "Run!" she hissed, pointing toward the shore. We sprinted along the walkway, our footsteps thundering on the wooden planks. Behind us, the window shattered outward, glass tinkling into the lake. Something dark and glistening pushed through the opening. An arm, impossibly elongated and dripping with lake water. The walkway ended abruptly at a small platform. Below us was the lake, black and forbidding in the starlight. To our right, a short jump away, was the main dock that led back to shore. "We have to jump to the dock," Josephine said, already positioning herself for the leap. "On 3. 1, 2... She never reached 3. From beneath the walkway, something surged upward, splintering the wood beneath our feet. I fell backward, narrowly avoiding the grasping fingers that punched through the planks. Josephine wasn't as lucky. A pale hand, bloated and inhuman, clamped around her ankle. She screamed, a sound quickly cut short as she was yanked downward with impossible strength. The walkway collapsed further, and Josephine disappeared into the black water with barely a splash. "Josephine!" I screamed, scrambling to the edge of the broken platform. The lake's surface was already smooth again, as if nothing had disturbed it. Without thinking, I dove in. The water was shockingly warm, almost body temperature. Beneath the surface, I opened my eyes, expecting the sting of lake water. Instead, I could see with unnatural clarity in what should have been total darkness. Josephine was being pulled downward, her struggles growing weaker as she descended. Above her, or rather, around her, was a figure so horrifying my mind initially refused to process what I was seeing. It wasn't a girl or even a human as I'd expected. The thing dragging Josephine into the depths was a nightmarish amalgamation of disparate parts, limbs of different sizes fused together around a central mass, multiple faces partially merged into one another. I recognized the face I'd seen beneath my canoe among them, but it was just one of many. With a surge of desperate strength, I swam deeper, reaching for Josephine's outstretched hand. Our fingers touched, then clasped. I pulled with all my might, kicking toward the surface. The thing, I couldn't think of it as Andrea anymore, tightened its grip on Josephine's leg. A sound vibrated through the water, not quite a voice, but communicating unmistakable rage. More limbs extended from the central mass, reaching for me. My lungs burned for air. Black spots danced at the edges of my vision. In a final, desperate effort, I yanked Josephine upward, simultaneously kicking at the grotesque appendage that held her. To my shock, the limb broke off, dissolving into the water like ink. The creature recoiled, its many faces contorting in silent screams. With the last of my strength, I pulled Josephine toward the surface. We broke through together, gasping and choking. The dock was just a few yards away. I dragged her toward it, heaving her onto the wooden planks before hauling myself up beside her. What was that thing?" Josephine sputtered between coughs. Before I could answer, lights flared across the camp. Shouts echoed as counselors and staff emerged from their cabins, alerted by our screams. "It wasn't Andrea," I managed, my voice raw. "It was everyone. Everyone who's gone into that lake and never come back." Understanding dawned in Josephine's eyes, followed by horror. "It's collecting them," she whispered. "All this time we thought it was just Andrea, but it's been... What in God's name are you two doing?" Ms. Winters's voice cut through the night as she strode down the dock, flanked by two counselors. Her face, illuminated by the flashlight she carried, was twisted with an emotion that went beyond anger. It was fear. "We know what's in the lake," Josephine said, struggling to her feet. "We know what happened to Andrea. What's been happening for years." Ms. Winters went very still. "Take these two to the infirmary," she instructed the counselors. "They're in shock. Hypothermia, most likely." "We're telling everyone," I threatened, finding courage in the aftermath of terror. "About the records, about what's really in the lake." "No one will believe you," Ms. Winters replied coldly. "Two hysterical girls who broke curfew to go swimming? You'll be sent home for endangering yourselves, nothing more." As the counselors led us away, I glanced back at the lake. Its surface was perfectly still once more, but I knew now what lurked beneath. Not a ghost, not a drowned girl seeking revenge, but something far worse. Something that had been feeding on the camp's secrets for decades. And Ms. Winters knew all about it. The infirmary was a small building near the main lodge, equipped with basic medical supplies and 4 narrow beds. The camp nurse, Mrs. Bennett, checked us over with clinical efficiency, clucking her tongue at our soaked clothes and scraped limbs. "Hypothermia risk. Possible shock," she muttered, wrapping thermal blankets around our shoulders. "What possessed you girls to go swimming at this hour?" Neither Josephine nor I answered. We sat side by side on one of the beds, shivering despite the warmth of the room. It wasn't cold that made us tremble, but the memory of what we'd seen in the lake's depths. Ms. Winters entered after a brief conversation with the counselors outside. Her face was composed now, the fear I'd seen earlier carefully masked behind a professional demeanor. "Mrs. Bennett, would you give us a moment?" she asked. "I need to speak with the girls about the seriousness of their actions." The nurse hesitated, glancing between us and the camp director. "They should rest." "It won't take long," Ms. Winters insisted, her tone leaving no room for argument. Once we were alone, Ms. Winters closed the blinds on the infirmary windows and turned to face us. In the harsh fluorescent lighting, I noticed details about her I hadn't before. The unnatural tightness around her eyes, the slight tremor in her left hand, the way her skin seemed oddly textured in places, almost scale-like. 23 years, she began, her voice eerily calm. "I've kept this camp running for 23 years since that night. Do you have any idea what you've done?" "We know what's in the lake," Josephine replied, her voice stronger than I expected. "We know about Andrea and the others." Ms. Winters laughed, a brittle sound devoid of humor. "You know nothing. You saw something you can't possibly understand, and now you think you know the truth." "Then tell us," I challenged. "Tell us what really happened to Andrea Walsh." The camp director studied us for a long moment, as if weighing her options. Finally, she pulled up a chair and sat facing us, her posture rigid. "Andrea was special," she began. "Different from the other girls. She sensed things, knew things she shouldn't have known. Like you." She nodded toward me. "From the moment you arrived, I knew you would be trouble. You have the same sensitivity." "What does that mean?" I asked, unnerved by the comparison. "It means the lake called to her, just as it's been calling to you. Ms. Winters leaned forward. This isn't an ordinary lake. The Native Americans who lived here called it the Devouring Water. They believed it was a gateway to another place. Not heaven or hell, but somewhere in between. Josephine gripped my hand tightly. What happened that night? The records show you were with her. Ms. Winters' expression darkened. Andrea had been sleepwalking toward the lake for days. I started staying up, watching her cabin. That night, I followed her to the dock. She was standing at the edge, staring into the water as if she could see something beneath the surface. She paused, her gaze distant with memory. I tried to take her back to her cabin, but she fought me. Said they were calling her, that she had to join them. I didn't understand what she meant until the water began to move. Move how? I prompted when she fell silent. It rose up, Ms. Winters whispered. Not like a wave, like it was reaching for her. I grabbed her arm, tried to pull her back, but the water, it took her. Pulled her in so fast I barely saw it happen. I dove in after her, but she was just gone. The account aligned with what Josephine had told me about her aunt being an excellent swimmer. If she had been pulled under as suddenly as Ms. Winters described, she would have had no chance to save herself. Why didn't you tell the truth? Josephine demanded. My family has spent 23 years not knowing what really happened to her. Because I did tell the truth at first, Ms. Winters snapped. To the police, to the camp owners. They thought I was insane. Decided I must have been negligent, allowed a camper to drown on my watch. I was nearly charged with criminal negligence. She stood abruptly, pacing the small room. Then the investigators started disappearing. 2 divers went into the lake to search for Andrea's body. Only one came back up, raving about hands in the darkness. He killed himself 3 days later. My skin crawled at the implication. The thing in the lake, it's been there all along? It's been growing, Ms. Winters corrected. Every person it takes becomes part of it. Andrea was just one of many over the centuries, but after her, it became more active, hungry. So you've been feeding it, Josephine said, the accusation hanging heavy in the air. All these years, girls have been having accidents in the lake, becoming part of whatever that thing is. Ms. Winters' face contorted with genuine outrage. I've been protecting them, keeping them away from the deep water, establishing safety protocols. But some always slip through, the ones it calls to, like Andrea, like you. She pointed at me. You recognized me, I realized. The first day, you knew I could sense it. You have the look, she confirmed. The same one Andrea had. That's why I assigned Iris to watch you closely. Why keep the camp open at all? I asked. If you know what's in the lake, why not shut this place down? Ms. Winters laughed again, that same hollow sound. You think I haven't tried? The first year after Andrea, I recommended closure. The owners refused. Too much money invested. When I threatened to go public, I found I couldn't leave. Couldn't leave? Josephine repeated. Ms. Winters rolled up her sleeve slowly, revealing her forearm. In the fluorescent light, the skin appeared mottled, with an almost translucent quality. Beneath the surface, something dark moved, like shadows flowing through water. It marked me that night when I tried to save her, she said quietly. A piece of it, inside me. I can't go beyond the camp boundaries now. Believe me, I've tried. Horror washed over me as I realized the implications. Ms. Winters wasn't just a witness or a conspirator. She was a victim herself, partially claimed by the entity in the lake. So you've been trapped here for 23 years, I said, watching it take more victims. Fewer than you might think, she countered. 3 in all that time. I've gotten better at recognizing the ones it wants, keeping them safe. Until now, Josephine said. It wants her. She nodded toward me. Ms. Winters didn't deny it. It's been more active since you arrived. Agitated. The water temperature has risen 2 degrees in 5 days. That only happens when it's preparing to feed. The clinical way she discussed my potential death chilled me more than the entity itself. What do we do now? You go home, Ms. Winters said firmly. Both of you. First thing tomorrow. I'll tell your parents there was an incident, that you broke curfew and endangered yourselves. It's even true. And then what? Josephine demanded. The camp stays open? That thing keeps growing, taking more girls every few years? My aunt remains part of that abomination? There's nothing to be done about it, Ms. Winters insisted. Nothing human can harm it. Trust me, I've spent 2 decades trying to find a way. There has to be something, I said. Some way to destroy it or contain it. Ms. Winters studied me with a mixture of pity and resignation. The indigenous people who lived here believed it could only be appeased through sacrifice. That's why they abandoned this area centuries ago. Too many of their children went missing. We're not sacrificing anyone, Josephine stated flatly. No, Ms. Winters agreed, which is why you're both leaving tomorrow, and why neither of you will speak of this again to anyone. Or what? I challenged. Ms. Winters leaned close, her voice dropping to a whisper. Or I can't protect you. Not from the thing in the lake, and not from what would happen if the truth got out. The camp would close, yes. But I'm not the only one marked by it. There are others, people in positions of authority who've helped keep this quiet over the years. People who've made their own arrangements with what lives in those waters. The implication was clear. This conspiracy extended beyond the camp, perhaps to local officials or others who had encountered the entity and been changed by it, as Ms. Winters had been. Get some rest, she said, rising to leave. Your parents will be called first thing in the morning. After she left, Josephine and I sat in stunned silence for several minutes. We can't just leave, she finally said, not knowing what we know now. What choice do we have? I asked. You heard her. That thing is beyond our ability to fight. Josephine's expression hardened with determination. Andrea is in there. Part of her anyway. I can't leave her like that. And if we do nothing, more girls will be taken. What are you suggesting? She reached into her still damp backpack and pulled out the ledger we'd stolen from the boathouse. There might be something in here. Records of other incidents, maybe information about the lake's history that could help us understand what we're dealing with. We spent the next hour poring over the water-damaged pages, searching for any clue that might help us confront the entity. Most entries were mundane: equipment maintenance, weather conditions, scheduling notes. But scattered throughout were cryptic references to containment protocols and boundary maintenance. Look at this, Josephine said, pointing to an entry from 1998. Annual reinforcement of ward stones completed. Perimeter secure for another season. Ward stones? I repeated. That sounds like someone's been keeping that thing contained in the lake, Josephine finished. All this time, there's been something holding it back, preventing it from extending its reach beyond the water. Further entries confirmed our theory. Every spring before camp opened, Mr. Harmon and Ms. Winters performed some kind of ritual around the lake's perimeter, placing or reinforcing ward stones at key locations. That's why it can pull people in, but can't come out itself, I realized. These stones form a barrier. A barrier that's weakening, Josephine added grimly, pointing to more recent entries noting deterioration at the northwest marker and increasing pressure on the southern boundary. The most recent entry, dated just 3 weeks earlier, was particularly disturbing. Containment failing. Estimate complete breach within 1 season if reinforcement impossible. Alternative measures may be necessary. Alternative measures, I echoed. What does that mean? Josephine closed the ledger, her expression grim. I think Ms. Winters has been planning something. something desperate. A thought occurred to me then, so terrible I almost couldn't voice it. What if that's why you're here? Why your parents suddenly allowed you to come to the camp where your aunt died? What are you saying? Ms. Winters said the indigenous people believed the entity could be appeased through sacrifice. What if she's been guiding certain girls here? Girls connected to previous victims? The color drained from Josephine's face. You think she brought me here as a potential sacrifice? To appease that thing? Or to save everyone else? I said quietly. If the containment is failing, and she's tried everything else. Before Josephine could respond, the infirmary door opened. Mrs. Bennett returned, looking tired but professional. You girls should try to sleep. We've called your parents, but they won't be able to pick you up until morning. We exchanged a look, silently agreeing to continue our discussion later. As Mrs. Bennett checked our temperatures and blood pressure one final time, I noticed something I'd missed before, a small tattoo on her wrist, partially hidden by her watch. It appeared to be a symbol, concentric circles with lines radiating outward, like a stylized sun or star. The same symbol I'd seen etched into the dock pillars and on stones around the lake's edge. The nurse caught me staring and quickly pulled her sleeve down. Try to rest, she said, her tone suddenly cooler. You've had quite a shock. After she left, I whispered to Josephine. She has the symbol. The ward symbol. They're all in on it, Josephine whispered back. The whole staff must be involved in containing that thing. Or serving it, I suggested darkly. We fell into uneasy silence, both pretending to sleep while our minds raced with the horrifying implications of what we'd discovered. Outside, the night grew deeper, and somewhere beyond the infirmary walls, the lake waited. Patient, hungry, and increasingly unbound. Dawn arrived with a tentative knock on the infirmary door. Iris entered, carrying fresh clothes for both of us. Her usually cheerful demeanor was subdued, her movements stiff as she placed the clothes at the foot of our beds. Your parents have been called, she informed us, avoiding eye contact. They'll arrive around noon. Ms. Winters would like to speak with you both after breakfast. We know about the ward stones, I said bluntly, watching for her reaction. Iris froze momentarily, then continued smoothing out the clothes as if I hadn't spoken. Breakfast is in 20 minutes. I'll come back to escort you. Is that why you're all here? Josephine pressed. To maintain the containment? To feed it when necessary? Iris finally looked at us, her expression a mixture of fear and resignation. You don't understand what you're dealing with. Neither of you do. She lowered her voice. Just go home. Forget about this place. Forget what you saw. Like you've forgotten the girls it's taken? I challenged. Something flashed in Iris's eyes. Anger, or perhaps guilt. We remember everyone, she said quietly. Their names are carved on the stones that keep that thing from spreading beyond the lake. Their sacrifice protects countless others. This confirmation of our worst suspicions left us momentarily speechless. Iris used our silence to retreat, pausing at the door. 20 minutes. Be ready. After she left, Josephine and I dressed quickly, both processing what we'd learned. We need to see those stones, Josephine said as she pulled on the camp-issued sweatshirt. The complete circle of them. Maybe there's a way to strengthen the containment without more sacrifices. Or a way to destroy the entity entirely, I added. If there was, don't you think they would have done it by now? Ms. Winters has been trapped here for 23 years. She's had every reason to find a solution. She had a point. Whatever lived in the lake had resisted all attempts to destroy it for centuries. Even the indigenous people had eventually abandoned the area, rather than continue fighting it. Then what do we do? I asked. Josephine zipped her backpack, which still contained the stolen ledger. First, we play along. Let them think we're cooperating. Then, before our parents arrive, we find those ward stones and see for ourselves what we're dealing with. Breakfast was a tense affair. The other campers watched us curiously as we entered the dining hall with Iris. Rumors had clearly spread about our nighttime adventure, though I doubted anyone had guessed the truth. Samantha approached our table, concern evident on her face. "Are you okay? Everyone's saying you went swimming in the middle of the night and nearly drowned." "We're fine," I assured her, attempting a casual tone. "Just did something stupid. Our parents are coming to get us later." "Both of you? But camp just started?" Samantha protested. "Can't you talk to Ms. Winters, explain it was just a mistake?" If only she knew how impossible that was. "It's complicated," I said. "I'll call you when I get home. Explain everything." Though I had no intention of telling Samantha the truth, some knowledge was too dangerous, too burdensome. Let her enjoy her summer, unaware of what lurked beneath the placid surface of Evergreen Lake. After breakfast, Iris escorted us to Ms. Winters' office in the main lodge. The camp director sat behind a large oak desk, looking as if she hadn't slept. The strange mottling on her skin seemed more pronounced in the morning light, extending visibly up her neck. "Your parents will be here in a few hours," she began without preamble. "Until then, you'll remain under supervision. No wandering, no talking to other campers about what happened last night." "We know about the ward stones," Josephine said, repeating what we'd told Iris. "We know you've been using them to contain the entity in the lake." Ms. Winters' expression didn't change. "Then you understand the gravity of the situation. This isn't some ghost story or urban legend. What lives in that lake has been there since before European settlers arrived. It's patient, intelligent, and growing stronger." "The ledger mentioned the containment is failing," I said. "What happens when it breaks completely?" Ms. Winters sighed heavily, suddenly looking every one of her years and more. "First, the water will rise. The lake will expand beyond its natural boundaries. Then it will begin to spread its influence. Dreams at first, calling to people for miles around. Those who answer the call will walk into the water voluntarily, adding to its mass. Eventually it won't need the water at all. It will be able to extend itself onto land." The horror of this scenario struck us both silent. It wasn't just Camp Evergreen at risk, but potentially the entire region. "How long?" Josephine finally asked. "At the current rate of deterioration? By next summer, the containment will fail completely." Ms. Winters leaned forward. "That's why we've been researching alternatives, ways to strengthen the ward stones or other solutions." "Sacrifices," I said flatly, "like the indigenous people used to do." Ms. Winters didn't deny it. "Voluntary ones, if possible. Those already marked by the lake who carry a piece of it within them. Like me." The implication stunned us. "You're planning to sacrifice yourself?" Josephine asked. "I've been preparing for it for years," Ms. Winters confirmed. "Strengthening my connection to the entity, learning its patterns, its weaknesses, such as they are. When the time comes, I'll offer myself willingly. It may buy another decade of containment. Or it might make it stronger," I countered. "If you're already partially merged with it, your sacrifice could be exactly what it needs to break free completely." Doubt flickered across Ms. Winters' face. "That's a possibility we've considered, but the alternatives are worse." "There has to be another way," Josephine insisted. "Something in the camp's history, or in the indigenous lore about the lake." Ms. Winters was quiet for a moment, studying us both. "There is one account. From the 1800s, when the first European settlers came to this area. A traveling preacher claimed to have confronted the entity and driven it deeper into the lake, weakening it temporarily." "How?" I pressed, desperate for any solution that didn't involve human sacrifice. The account is fragmented. Something about purification through sacred flame and binding the water with earth and air. Most likely religious symbolism rather than literal instructions. Ms. Winters shook her head. We've tried everything over the years. Fire, chemicals, even explosives placed strategically around the lake. Nothing affects it. But something in her words had triggered a memory. Mr. Harmon's careful explanation of the lake's unusual hydrology and underground springs. The springs, I said suddenly. The underwater currents. That's how it spreads its influence, isn't it? Through the water system beneath the lake. Ms. Winters looked surprised at my insight. Yes, the entity isn't confined to the lake itself. It extends through the underground water table. The ward stones create a perimeter that prevents it from expanding further, but they don't affect the deep connections. So to truly contain it, you'd need to cut off those underground connections, Josephine reasoned. Seal the springs somehow. Precisely what we've been unable to do, Ms. Winters confirmed. We've consulted geologists, hydrologists, discreetly, of course. The spring system is too extensive, too deep. We'd need to essentially restructure the entire lake bed. An idea was forming in my mind. An impossible, dangerous idea that nonetheless felt right. What if you didn't need to seal every spring? What if you just needed to change what flows through them? Both Josephine and Ms. Winters looked at me questioningly. The entity is water-based, I continued, thinking aloud. Everything we've seen suggests it needs water to maintain its form and influence. What if we introduce something into the spring system that would make the water inhospitable to it? We've tried chemicals, Ms. Winters reminded me. Industrial-strength compounds that would have killed any natural organism. The entity simply absorbed them, incorporated them into itself. Not chemicals, I said. Something elemental, something natural that opposes water. Understanding dawned on Josephine's face. Fire. Not literal flames, but its essence. Heat. The geothermal vents. Ms. Winters breathed, her eyes widening. There's a dormant geothermal system beneath this region. It's why the lake never freezes, even in the deepest winter. If those vents could be activated somehow, I suggested, the increased heat might drive the entity back, weaken it enough that the ward stones could fully contain it again. Ms. Winters was already moving, pulling old maps and geological surveys from a cabinet behind her desk. The original camp builders considered using the geothermal energy for heating, but abandoned the idea as too costly. The surveys should still be here. She spread several yellowed documents across her desk. We gathered around, examining diagrams of the lake and the surrounding geological features. One map, dated 1962, showed the network of springs feeding into the lake, with several larger ones marked in red. These are the main intake points, Ms. Winters explained, pointing to the red markings. If we could introduce enough heat here, here, and here, it might create a natural barrier. How do we activate dormant geothermal vents? Josephine asked, the practical question bringing us back to reality. Ms. Winters straightened, a new determination in her bearing. There are methods. Drilling, hydraulic stimulation. But they require specialized equipment, expertise, and time, I added, which we don't have. Our parents will be here in a few hours. Leave that to me, Ms. Winters said with surprising resolve. I can delay them, create some excuse about road closures or administrative procedures. Josephine looked skeptical. Why are you suddenly willing to help us? You were ready to send us home and continue with your sacrifice plan. Ms. Winters' expression softened slightly. Because in 23 years, you're the first to suggest something we haven't tried. Something that addresses the root of the problem rather than just containing its symptoms. She moved to her desk phone and dialed a number. Mr. Harmon, meet me in my office immediately, and bring the old geological equipment from Storage Shed 3. After hanging up, she turned back to us, If we're going to do this, we need to move quickly. The entity will sense what we're attempting. It will try to stop us. How? I asked, suddenly fearful. It's confined to the lake. Its physical form is, Ms. Winters corrected. But its influence extends further. It can affect weather patterns near the lake, manipulate local wildlife, and... She hesitated. Work through those it has marked. She rolled up her sleeve again, revealing the mottled skin beneath. Like me, part of me belongs to it already. If it senses a true threat, it might be able to override my resistance. Then we need help, Josephine declared. People who haven't been marked, who can continue if you're compromised. Ms. Winters nodded reluctantly. Mr. Harmon has remained relatively unaffected. He never enters the water. And there's Mrs. Bennett. She joined us only 2 years ago, primarily to help research potential solutions. What about Iris and the other counselors? I asked. To varying degrees, all the long-term staff have been influenced. It's unavoidable when you spend years near the lake, but some have developed more resistance than others. The door opened and Mr. Harmon entered, carrying a large metal case. His weathered face registered surprise at seeing us, then understanding as he took in the map spread across the desk. You're going to attempt stimulation, he stated rather than asked. Ms. Winters nodded. These two have provided insight we've been missing. We need to target the main springs, introduce enough heat to drive the entity back and weaken its hold. Mr. Harmon set down the case and opened it, revealing an array of sophisticated equipment, drilling attachments, measuring devices, and what appeared to be small explosive charges. These were left by the Geological Survey team in the 70s, he explained, noticing my alarmed expression. Controlled charges designed to open blocked thermal vents. We considered using them years ago, but couldn't determine the correct placement points. The ward stones, Josephine said suddenly. They must be positioned at key points around the lake, places where the entity's influence is strongest. Ms. Winters looked impressed. Yes, they correspond to the mainspring outlets. Then that's where we place the charges, I concluded. Not to destroy the ward stones, but to use their positions as guides for accessing the underground system. As Mr. Harmon and Ms. Winters began discussing technical details, I felt a strange sensation. A pressure behind my eyes, accompanied by a faint humming that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. From Josephine's pained expression, I could tell she felt it too. It knows, I whispered to her. It's aware of what we're planning. Outside, the weather was changing rapidly. The clear morning sky had darkened with ominous clouds that seemed to gather directly over the lake. A wind had risen, bending the trees along the shoreline. We need to move quickly, Ms. Winters announced, gathering the maps. Mr. Harmon, assemble a team. Mrs. Bennett, Iris, if you think she's strong enough, and Max from maintenance. Tell them only what they absolutely need to know. What about us? Josephine asked. Ms. Winters hesitated. You should remain here, where it's safer. No, I said firmly. We discovered this solution. We're seeing it through. And Andrea was my aunt, Josephine added. I have a right to be there if there's any chance of freeing her from that thing. After a moment's consideration, Ms. Winters nodded. Very well, but you follow instructions precisely. No heroics, no deviations from the plan. Understood? We both agreed, though I wondered if any plan could truly prepare us for confronting the entity again. As we exited the office, the wind outside had strengthened to a gale, and distant thunder rolled across the sky. The lake, visible through the lodge windows, was no longer still. Its surface roiled with waves that seemed to move against the wind, as if something enormous was stirring in its depths. The storm intensified as our small group made its way toward the lake. Wind whipped through the trees, sending branches crashing to the ground around us. The sky had darkened to an unnatural shade of green-black, and lightning flashed directly over the water with increasing frequency. It's fighting back! Ms. Winters shouted over the wind. "The entity controls the local weather patterns when threatened." Our group consisted of 7 people: Ms. Winters, Mr. Harmon, Mrs. Bennett, Max, a burly maintenance worker, Iris, Josephine, and myself. We carried equipment distributed among waterproof backpacks, drilling attachments, the small explosive charges, and various measuring devices. Mr. Harmon led us not to the main dock, but to a less used trail that circled the lake. "We need to access all 12 ward stones," he explained. "They form a complete perimeter around the water." The first stone was located in a small clearing about 50 yards from the shore. It appeared unremarkable at first glance, just a rough boulder about waist high. But as we approached, I could see the elaborate symbols carved into its surface: concentric circles, radiating lines, and strange angular glyphs that seemed to shift when viewed directly. More striking was the name carved at the stone's base: Andrea Walsh. Josephine stopped abruptly upon seeing it. "You used her name," she said to Ms. Winters, accusation in her voice. "You bound her to this place even after death." "Not my choice," Ms. Winters replied grimly. "The stones draw power from connection. Names have power, especially the names of those the entity has claimed. They help maintain the barrier." Mr. Harmon had already begun setting up equipment, unfazed by the increasingly violent weather. He attached a narrow drill bit to a portable motor and began carefully boring into the ground beside the stone. "The ward stones are positioned directly above the main spring outlets," Ms. Winters explained as we watched. "We need to create access points approximately 15 feet deep to reach the water channels." The drill made surprisingly quick progress through the soil and underlying rock. Once it reached the desired depth, Mr. Harmon withdrew it and prepared one of the small cylindrical charges. "These are designed for geological work," he assured us, noting our nervous expressions. "Highly directed, minimal collateral impact. They'll create fissures that allow the deeper geothermal heat to rise into the spring channels." As he lowered the charge into the hole, a horrific screeching sound cut through the storm's noise. It came from the lake, a sound no natural creature could make, like metal tearing combined with 1,000 voices crying out in unison. The water began to rise visibly, swelling toward the shore in defiance of natural tides or wind patterns. A thick mist formed above its surface, rapidly spreading toward us. "It's extending itself," Ms. Winters warned. "Everyone stay back from the water's edge." Mr. Harmon finished setting the first charge and activated its timer. 10 minutes, he announced. "We need to move quickly to the next position." We hurried along the trail to the second ward stone, fighting against wind that seemed deliberately intent on pushing us toward the encroaching water. The mist had reached the shoreline now, advancing through the trees like seeking tendrils. The second stone bore another name: Eleanor Price, 2007. One of the 3 victims Ms. Winters had mentioned from her 23 years at the camp. Mr. Harmon repeated the drilling process while Max and Mrs. Bennett kept watch on the approaching mist. "If it touches you, don't panic," Ms. Winters instructed. "It's attempting to establish connection, to access your thoughts. Focus on something concrete, a memory, a name, a simple counting pattern. Don't let your mind wander." As if summoned by her warning, the mist surged forward suddenly, enveloping our group before we could retreat. It was warm and thick, clinging to skin and clothes with unnatural persistence. And within it, I heard voices, whispers at first, then clearer communications. "Join us. Be part of something greater. No more pain. No more fear. Only belonging." The voices were seductive, promising peace and acceptance. I found myself taking an involuntary step toward the lake, drawn by their hypnotic quality. "Focus!" Ms. Winters shouted, her voice seeming to come from a great distance. "Ground yourselves!" With tremendous effort, I pulled my thoughts back, concentrating on a simple multiplication table. 2 times 2 is 4, 4 times 2 is 8. anything to drown out the enticing whispers. Not everyone was successful. Iris had begun walking steadily toward the water, her eyes glazed and unfocused. Max lunged forward, grabbing her arm and physically restraining her. "Finished," Mr. Harmon announced, activating the second charge. "Next location quickly." We moved as a group, supporting those who struggled against the entity's influence. The mist followed, thickening around us. Through breaks in the fog, I could see the lake water had risen several feet, now lapping at areas of the camp that should have been well above the shoreline. The third wardstone bore the name Maria Gonzalez, 2013. The fourth, Samuel Winters. Josephine noticed the last name immediately. "A relative?" she asked Ms. Winters. "My husband," the camp director replied, her voice hollow. "He came looking for me after I couldn't leave. The entity took him instead." This revelation cast Ms. Winters' decades-long vigil in a new light. She hadn't just been trapped here by the mark on her skin, she'd been bound by grief and guilt as well. By the sixth stone, the first charge detonated. The ground shook beneath our feet, and from the direction of the first wardstone, a plume of steam erupted. A moment later, an unearthly howl rose from the lake, the entity's response to the first successful geothermal breach. "It's working," Mrs. Bennett confirmed, checking readings on a thermometer-like device. "Water temperature at the first spring is rising rapidly." The entity's reaction was immediate and violent. The mist around us congealed, becoming almost solid in consistency. It pressed against us from all sides, seeking entry through every available opening, nostrils, mouths, even the pores of our skin. Ms. Winters suddenly collapsed, convulsing on the ground. Her skin rippled as if something moved beneath it, and when she opened her eyes, they were completely black. "You cannot stop what has always been," she said, her voice overlaid with countless others speaking in unison. "This vessel has served us faithfully. Now all of you will join the collective." Mr. Harmon reacted without hesitation, dragging Ms. Winters away from the equipment as she thrashed and clawed at him. "Continue the work," he shouted to Max and Mrs. Bennett. "Complete the circle." The second charge detonated, then the third in quick succession. Each blast sent more steam rising from the ground, and with each release, the entity's howls grew more desperate. We pushed forward through the mist, completing the preparations at each wardstone. My lungs burned from the effort of filtering the thick air, and my skin crawled with the sensation of countless invisible fingers probing for weakness. Josephine stayed close beside me, her face set in grim determination. "3 more," she encouraged as we reached the 10th stone. "We're almost there." The lake had risen to unprecedented levels, flooding much of the camp. From our elevated position on the trail, we could see cabins partially submerged, the main dock completely underwater. The entity was throwing its full might against us, using the very element it controlled as a weapon. As Max finished drilling at the 11th stone, a massive surge of water burst from the lake, forming into a towering column that defied physics and gravity. At its center was a shape, a grotesque amalgamation of human features, partially formed and constantly shifting. Multiple limbs extended from a central mass, and faces pressed outward from within, mouths open in silent screams. Among them, I recognized the face I'd seen beneath my canoe, young, female, with an expression of eternal torment. Andrea Walsh, or what remained of her. "Andrea!" Josephine cried out, taking an involuntary step toward the apparition. "It's not her." I grabbed Josephine's arm, pulling her back. "Not anymore. It's using her image to manipulate you." The water column surged forward, sweeping across the ground toward us. Mr. Harmon shouted a warning, but too late. The leading edge engulfed Max before he could retreat. We watched in horror as he was lifted off his feet, his body seeming to dissolve into the churning mass. "The charge!" Mrs. Bennett screamed. "It's still in his hand." Indeed, the final explosive was clutched in Max's partially subsumed fist as the entity absorbed him. If we couldn't retrieve it or activate it, our entire plan would fail at the final step. Without thinking, I lunged forward, reaching into the water column for the charge. The liquid felt alive, clinging to my arm with conscious malevolence. Faces pressed against my skin. Max is among them now, his features already blurring as he was assimilated into the collective. My fingers brushed against the metal cylinder. With a supreme effort, I closed my hand around it and yanked backward. The entity resisted, pulling against me. For a terrible moment, I felt myself being drawn inward, my consciousness beginning to fragment as hundreds of voices crowded into my mind. Then, Josephine was beside me, her arms around my waist, pulling with all her strength. Together, we tore free, falling backward onto solid ground with the charge clutched in my burning hand. Mr. Harmon didn't waste a moment. He grabbed the device, rushed to the 11th drilling site, and dropped it in, activating the timer. "Final position," he shouted, already moving toward the 12th ward stone. The entity's water column collapsed, splashing back to the ground but immediately beginning to reform. We ran the final 100 yards to the last stone, which stood atop a small rise overlooking the lake. This stone was different from the others, larger, more elaborately carved, and bearing no single name. Instead, it was covered with dozens of names, dates stretching back centuries. At its base, a small depression had been carved out, lined with metal that gleamed dully in the stormlight. "The Master Stone," Mrs. Bennett explained as Mr. Harmon began drilling. "The focal point of the entire containment system. The 12 stones form a circle, but this one channels their energy." The 11th charge detonated, and the entity's scream reached a new pitch of rage and pain. The water column had reformed, larger than before, surging toward our position with frightening speed. "It knows what we're doing," Mrs. Bennett said, her voice surprisingly calm. "It will throw everything it has at us now." Mr. Harmon finished drilling and prepared to place the final charge. As he reached for the detonator, the ground beneath us trembled violently. A fissure opened between him and the hole, nearly swallowing him before he leaped clear. "I can't reach it," he shouted, as the crack widened. The water column was almost upon us, its leading edge morphing into grasping hands and snarling mouths. Within its mass, I could now see not just Andrea and Max, but Ms. Winters as well. Her form distorted but recognizable among the countless others. Josephine stepped forward, the final charge in her hand. She had retrieved it when Mr. Harmon dropped it. "I'll do it," she said, determination in every line of her body. "For Andrea." Before anyone could stop her, she leaped across the widening fissure, landing precariously on the other side. The entity surged forward, water crashing around her legs as she knelt by the drill hole. "Josephine!" I screamed, watching in horror as the water began to creep up her body. She looked back at me one last time, a sad smile on her face. "Tell my mother what really happened," she called. "Tell her Andrea wasn't alone." With that, she dropped the charge into the hole and pressed the detonator. The entity's water engulfed her completely, just as the ground beneath the Master Stone erupted in a geyser of steam and superheated water. The effect was immediate and catastrophic for the entity. A chain reaction spread from the Master Stone to each of the 11 other sites, creating a circle of roaring geysers around the lake. The water column collapsed entirely, unable to maintain cohesion as the temperature rose. From the lake itself came a sound unlike anything I'd ever heard, not rage or pain, but something more complex. It reminded me of ice cracking on a frozen pond, multiplied 1,000-fold. The surface of the water began to literally fracture, as if it were a solid mass breaking apart. Steam rose in massive clouds, obscuring our view of the lake and most of the camp. The wind, which had been howling around us, stopped abruptly, leaving an eerie silence broken only by the hissing of the geysers and the continuing crack of the lake's surface. When the steam finally cleared enough for us to see, the lake had changed fundamentally. Its water level had dropped dramatically, revealing long submerged features of the lakebed. But more significantly, The water itself had changed. No longer the unnaturally clear dark blue it had been, but a cloudy, mineral-rich turquoise typical of geothermal pools. Where Josephine had stood, there was no sign remaining. The master stone had cracked down the middle, its elaborate carvings disrupted but still partially legible. Mr. Harmon approached it cautiously, testing the ground with each step. "It worked," he said in disbelief. The geothermal activation created a natural barrier the entity couldn't overcome. The heat, it forced it deeper, away from its sources of power. "Is it destroyed?" I asked, my voice raw from screaming Josephine's name. Mrs. Bennett shook her head. "Not destroyed, contained, perhaps permanently this time." She pointed to the fractured lake surface. "What you're seeing is its physical form breaking apart, losing cohesion. Without access to new material, it can't maintain itself." I understood what she meant by material. People, victims like Andrea and Max and now Josephine. The thought made me sick with grief and rage. And the others? The people it took? Are they released, I believe, Mrs. Bennett said gently. Not restored. That would be impossible after assimilation. But freed from the collective consciousness that bound them to the entity. I stared at the transformed lake, wanting to believe her but consumed by the knowledge of Josephine's sacrifice. She had given her life to end this horror, to free her aunt's spirit and prevent more victims. In the days that followed, as authorities tried to make sense of the natural disaster that had struck Camp Evergreen, I maintained the fiction that Josephine and I had simply been caught in a sudden storm and geological event. That Josephine had been swept away by floodwaters. That the strange lights and sounds reported by other campers were lightning and thunder. The camp closed permanently. The official explanation cited geological instability and unexpected thermal activity, rendering the site unsafe. Most of the staff disappeared quietly, moving on to other jobs in distant places. Mr. Harmon remained to oversee the demolition of the remaining structures and implementation of a permanent restricted zone around the lake. I returned home, carrying the truth with me like a physical weight. I kept my promise to Josephine, visiting her mother to explain what had really happened to Andrea and to her daughter. Whether she believed me or not, I couldn't say. But the letter I received months later, thanking me for giving her closure after so many years of uncertainty, suggested that on some level she accepted the truth. Sometimes, in my dreams, I still see Josephine's face in that final moment, not afraid, but resolute. I see Andrea too, and others I never knew, their features gradually separating from the grotesque collective, finding peace as they dissolved not into the entity, but into freedom. The lake remains cordoned off, classified as a geological hazard zone. Satellite images show it has continued to change, becoming smaller and more obviously geothermal in nature. Scientists study it from a distance, puzzled by its rapid transformation, but unwilling to approach too closely. They report that the water temperature remains unusually high, that wildlife avoids the area, that instruments malfunction when placed too near the shore. What they don't report, what they can't measure, is the absence. The lake is just a lake now. The weight of malevolence that hung over it for centuries has lifted. The hungry presence that waited in its depths has retreated to some place we can't reach. I know this because I visited once, a year after it happened. Standing at the edge of the restricted zone, I felt nothing calling to me. No whispers, no unsettling awareness of being watched. Just the ordinary sounds of wind through trees and water lapping at a rocky shore. Before leaving, I placed flowers on the fractured master stone. Not just for Josephine and Andrea, but for all those whose names were carved into its surface. The victims and the guardians. The sacrificed and the saved. The entity may not be destroyed, may never be truly gone. But it is contained, weakened, pushed back to whatever dark place spawned it. And if someday it begins to rise again, the knowledge of how to fight it remains, in my memories, in the geological records, in the truth I've preserved. Some nightmares can't be defeated entirely, but they can be faced, understood, and ultimately contained. I haven't been swimming since that summer. I probably never will again. Some fears mark you permanently, become part of who you are. But I've learned to live with the memories, to use them as a reminder of both human fragility and strength, of how much we risk when we ignore the warnings of the past, and how much we can accomplish when we face our deepest fears together. The Trans-Canada Highway fell away behind me as I turned onto the logging road, my Jeep bouncing over the uneven ground. 3 hours north of Thunder Bay, Ontario, I was already deeper into the wilderness than most weekend campers ventured. The radio had stopped picking up signals an hour ago, leaving only the rumble of tires on gravel and the occasional ping of rocks against the undercarriage. My name is Daniel Mercer, wildlife photographer and self-proclaimed adventure junkie. After 15 years of capturing images across 6 continents, I'd returned to my native Canada with a singular purpose: to document the untouched corners of the boreal forest. At least, that's what I told my editor. The truth was more complex, wrapped in childhood memories and local legends that had haunted the northern communities for generations. The Algonquin called it Wendigo territory. The loggers had their own stories of the hairy man of the woods. Scientists dismissed it all as folklore, but the locals knew better. Something walked these forests that defied conventional explanation. The GPS blinked out as pine branches closed overhead, forming a natural tunnel. I consulted my topographical map, tracing the route to Mackenzie Lake, a pristine body of water that hadn't seen regular human traffic since the logging operation shut down in '97. According to my research, there had been 17 reported sightings within 50 kilometers of the lake since 1985. 3 in the last year alone. As dusk approached, I found the clearing I'd marked, a natural opening among ancient pines with a view of the western shoreline. Perfect for both camp and wildlife observation. I worked efficiently, pitching my 4-season tent, hanging my food cache from a branch well away from my sleeping area, and setting up my primary camera trap facing the game trail that cut through the northern edge of the clearing. Only when the necessities were secured did I allow myself to listen to the forest. The wind whispered through pine needles, carrying scents of resin and decay. Somewhere distant, a loon called across water, its mournful cry echoing unanswered. But underneath it all was something else. A sensation more than a sound, the weight of awareness, of being watched. Just wildlife, I murmured, feeding branches into my small camp stove. The flames cast dancing shadows across my equipment. Bears, wolves, maybe a moose, nothing unusual. I'd spent enough nights in the wilderness to recognize the normal prickle of caution that comes with being a vulnerable human in predator territory. This felt different, more targeted, more deliberate. As full darkness descended, I reviewed my equipment one final time. Cameras, satellite phone, bear spray, and the Winchester rifle I'd inherited from my grandfather. I wasn't typically one for firearms, but something about this trip had prompted me to bring it. Call it intuition, call it paranoia. A branch snapped in the darkness, loud, deliberate, from somewhere beyond the light of my fire. Too heavy for a deer, too careless for a predator. I reached for the rifle, flicking the safety off with practiced ease. "Hello?" I called, my voice sounding unnaturally loud. "Anyone there?" The forest went silent. No insects, no rustling leaves, nothing. Then came the smell. Musky, primal, like wet fur and old blood. a smell no experienced woodsman would mistake for anything familiar. In my 15 years of wilderness photography across the globe, I'd encountered predators of all kinds. I'd documented tigers in India, polar bears in the Arctic, and crocodiles in the Amazon. But nothing in my experience had prepared me for what I felt in that moment. Pure, instinctual dread. Something inhuman was circling my camp. Sleep came in fitful bursts that night, my hand never far from the rifle beside my sleeping bag. Each time I drifted off, I'd jerk awake to sounds just beyond perception. Heavy footfalls, breathing that didn't match the rhythm of the forest, and once, a guttural vocalization unlike any animal I could identify. When dawn finally broke, I found the first evidence that my fears weren't merely imagination. A perfect line of tracks skirting the perimeter of my camp, pressed deep into the soft earth. Bigger than any bear print I'd ever documented. The stride length alone suggested a creature over 7 feet tall. I photographed each print methodically, placing my size 11 boot beside one for scale. My foot looked childlike in comparison. As I followed the tracks to the edge of the clearing, I discovered something that made my blood run cold. One of my remote camera traps had been dismantled. Not destroyed in the way a curious bear might, but carefully taken apart, the memory card missing. Something intelligent, something deliberate, something that understood exactly what my equipment was designed to do. And it didn't want to be seen. The lake stretched before me like a mirror, reflecting the morning sky with perfect clarity. Mackenzie Lake was renowned among locals for its unusual depth, over 200 meters in some places, and the strange stories that surrounded it. Indigenous elders spoke of spirits dwelling beneath its surface, and even the hardened loggers who'd worked the area refused to fish its waters. I paddled my collapsible kayak toward the center, intent on gathering samples for a biologist friend researching microbiome variations in isolated water systems. The rhythmic dip and pull of my paddle was meditative, allowing my mind to process the unsettling discoveries of the morning. The tracks were real, not imagination, not a practical joke. Something massive had circled my camp during the night, something intelligent enough to disable a camera trap. Rationalize it, I whispered to myself, words creating small puffs of condensation in the cool morning air. Black bear standing on hind legs, maybe a moose with unusual gait. But the excuses rang hollow. I'd tracked both species extensively. These were bipedal prints with 5 distinct toe impressions, too large for human, too structured for bear. A loon surfaced nearby, its red eyes regarding me with ancient curiosity before disappearing beneath the surface. I watched the ripples spread outward, mesmerized by the perfect symmetry of their expansion. Then I noticed that another set of ripples was intersecting with the first, ripples that couldn't have come from the diving bird. Something else had disturbed the water, something large, moving beneath the surface parallel to my kayak. I froze, paddle suspended mid-stroke, watching as the disturbance created a subtle wake. Whatever was down there was at least the size of a large sturgeon, but moved with deliberate purpose rather than the sinuous pattern of a fish. The wake disappeared, and I exhaled a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Just as I convinced myself it was simply an underwater current, the kayak jolted violently upward, nearly capsizing as something struck its underside. Heart pounding, I scrambled to stabilize the craft. Water sloshed over the sides, soaking my equipment. I reached for my waterproof camera, desperate to document whatever was happening, when the attack came again, this time with enough force to send me sprawling into the frigid waters of Mackenzie Lake. The cold hit like a physical blow, driving air from my lungs. I surfaced, gasping, just in time to see my kayak flipping completely over. My sample containers and scientific equipment sank rapidly into the crystal-clear depths. Through the perfect visibility, I watched them disappear into a darkness so absolute it seemed to swallow light itself. I treaded water, calculating my position. The shore was perhaps 200 meters away, a challenging swim in cold water, but manageable for someone with my experience. I struck out with powerful strokes, fighting the growing numbness in my extremities. Halfway to shore, I felt it, a gentle brush against my leg. Not the bump of a fish or the tangle of weeds, but the unmistakable sensation of fingers, long, powerful digits curling briefly around my ankle before releasing. Panic surged through me, overriding training and experience. I thrashed toward shore with desperate intensity, no longer concerned with form or efficiency. Behind me, something large displaced water. I could feel the pressure wave against my feet and legs. I didn't look back. Some primal instinct warned that seeing what pursued me would steal precious seconds I couldn't afford to lose. My feet finally struck bottom near the shoreline, and I half swam, half staggered onto the rocky beach, collapsing onto the stones. For several minutes, I simply lay there, coughing and shivering, before gathering the courage to look back at the lake. The surface was again a perfect mirror, undisturbed by wind or wildlife. My overturned kayak was nowhere to be seen. It was as if the lake had swallowed it whole. As my breathing steadied, I noticed something on the shoreline several meters away. My waterproof camera case, deliberately placed on a flat rock, its latches carefully opened. The memory card was missing, just like the one from my camera trap. Something intelligent enough to recognize what held the images. Something that didn't want to be recorded. I staggered back toward camp, hyper-aware of the forest around me. The sense of being watched had intensified, and twice I spun around, certain I'd glimpsed movement among the trees, a flash of something tall and dark slipping between trunks with impossible silence for its size. From across the lake came a sound that stopped me in my tracks. Not quite a howl, not quite a scream, but something that raised the hair on my neck and sent birds exploding from the treetops. It held for nearly 15 seconds, modulating in pitch and intensity in a way that suggested communication rather than random vocalization. I fumbled for my satellite phone, fingers trembling as I dialed the only person who might understand what I was experiencing. "Professor Nakamura," I said when the call connected, my voice tight with controlled panic. "It's Daniel Mercer. I'm at Mackenzie Lake. I think I've found it. And I think there's more than one." The line went dead, either from poor connection or something more deliberate. When I glanced down at the phone's screen, a single message appeared before the device powered down completely. "Get out now. They're not what we thought." The afternoon sun filtered through the canopy as I inventoried what remained of my equipment. The loss of my kayak and underwater sampling gear was devastating, but the real blow was psychological. Whatever was in these woods, whatever had circled my camp and pursued me in the lake, was methodically isolating me. First the camera traps, then my satellite phone, which refused to power back on, despite having shown nearly full battery moments before it died. Even my GPS unit was now displaying coordinates that made no sense, putting me somehow in northern Quebec rather than Ontario. I spread my topographical map across a flat rock, confirming my position the old-fashioned way. Mackenzie Lake was clearly marked, its unusual depth indicated by tightly clustered contour lines. I traced the shortest route back to the logging road, approximately 15 kilometers of dense forest, with one significant obstacle, a ravine cutting across my path about 5 kilometers east. "If I break camp now," I muttered, calculating distances against fading daylight, "I'd hit the ravine at dusk. Bad place to be after dark." The rational choice was to spend one more night, leave at first light, and push through to the road before nightfall tomorrow. But rationality was becoming increasingly difficult to cling to. I activated my backup satellite beacon, a simple emergency device that broadcast GPS coordinates to search and rescue services when triggered. It was meant as a last resort, but circumstances warranted caution. The small LED blinked reassuringly, indicating successful activation. Returning to camp, I discovered my tent had been disturbed, not ripped open like a bear might do, but methodically searched. My sleeping bag lay unzipped, my clothing neatly piled rather than stuffed in the backpack where I'd left it. Most disturbing was the arrangement of my field guides on Canadian wildlife, open to pages on great apes and primates, forming a semicircle on the ground. It was a message, or perhaps a question. From my backpack, I removed the small leather journal I'd found among my grandfather's belongings after his death. The pages were filled with meticulous notes and sketches documenting his encounters in these same forests 50 years earlier. Most wildlife biologists had dismissed his work as the fantasies of an amateur cryptozoologist, but I had recognized the precision of his observations, the same methodical documentation I employed in my own work. I flipped to a dog-eared page containing a detailed sketch of a footprint nearly identical to those I'd photographed that morning. Beside it, my grandfather had written, "Linguistic capabilities confirmed. Response to recorded calls. Evidence of tool use and social structure. Not ape, not human. Something parallel. Evolution finds many paths." Below this was a phonetic transcription of sounds he claimed to have recorded. Sounds remarkably similar to what I'd heard across the lake. The implications were staggering. If my grandfather was right, what walked these woods wasn't some undiscovered species of great ape, but something far more complex. A parallel evolutionary branch that had developed intelligence comparable to our own, while remaining hidden from scientific documentation. The crack of a branch snapping jerked me from my thoughts. I reached for the rifle, scanning the forest edge. Nothing moved, but the sensation of being watched intensified. "I know you're there," I called, surprising myself with my boldness. "I'm not here to harm you, I just want to understand." Silence answered, heavy with potential. Then, from a different direction came another deliberate snap of wood. Then another from elsewhere in the forest. They were surrounding the camp again, just as they had the previous night. I retreated to the center of the clearing, rifle ready, but pointed safely at the ground. My grandfather's notes suggested they understood the concept of weapons, possibly even firearms specifically. The forest had gone silent again, but this time the silence felt expectant rather than threatening. Testing a theory, I carefully set the rifle down on a flat rock, stepped back with hands raised, and waited. Minutes passed. Then, from the densest section of forest came a soft, rumbling vocalization. Not aggressive, but questioning. I remained still, hands visible, controlling my breathing despite the hammering of my heart. Movement caught my eye, a subtle shifting of shadows that didn't match the wind patterns through the trees. Something large moved with deliberate slowness, partially obscured by the undergrowth. I glimpsed what might have been an arm, massively muscled and covered in dark hair, reaching out to bend a sapling aside. Before I could see more, my emergency beacon erupted in a series of loud electronic beeps from inside my backpack, the automated response indicating the signal had been received and help was being dispatched. The reaction was immediate and terrifying. From all around the clearing came explosive vocalizations, not the curious rumbles of moments before, but alarm calls of unmistakable hostility. Trees shook as massive figures retreated rapidly into deeper forest. I lunged for my backpack, frantically digging for the beacon to silence it, but the damage was done. I'd inadvertently betrayed the tentative moment of contact. Worse, I'd associated myself with the electronic technology they seemed to distrust or fear. As night fell, I built my fire larger than safety would normally dictate, constructing a barrier of flames around my tent. The forest remained ominously quiet, but the sense of being watched had transformed into something more targeted, an evaluating presence that seemed to be making calculations. In the darkness beyond my firelight, eyes occasionally reflected the flames. Not at ground level where deer or predators would be, but at a height of over 7 feet. They never remained visible for more than a second, blinking out of existence as their owners shifted position. I retreated to my tent with the rifle across my lap, reading through my grandfather's journal by flashlight. On the final pages, his handwriting had become increasingly urgent, the normally meticulous notes replaced by hastily scrawled warnings. They remember generations of conflict with loggers, hunters, trappers. They associate human technology with threat. The younger ones want war. The elders restrain them, but their influence wanes. Stay away from water. They use it. They've always used it. The final entry, dated just 3 weeks before his fatal hunting accident, simply read, "They've made their decision about me. I hear them outside now. If found, destroy cameras. Names in my will know what to do." I closed the journal with trembling hands, understanding now why my grandfather's body had been discovered with all recording equipment methodically destroyed, why his research had never been published despite his meticulous documentation. Outside my tent, something heavy moved past, close enough that the ground vibrated slightly with each footfall. Not circling now, but deliberately approaching. I raised the rifle, finger resting lightly beside the trigger guard. The zipper of my tent began to rise, pulled from outside by something strong enough to break the interior lock I'd secured. I aimed the rifle at the widening gap, fighting against panic. Instead of the massive, hairy figure I expected, a smooth stone rolled through the opening, coming to rest on my sleeping bag. In the beam of my flashlight, I could see it was no ordinary rock, but one that had been worked, shaped into a crude but recognizable humanoid form with deep grooves marking eyes and mouth. A warning, a message. Before I could decipher its meaning, my radio crackled to life, equipment I'd written off as useless hours ago. Through bursts of static came a voice I recognized immediately. Professor Nakamura. "Repeat, Daniel. If you can hear this, evacuate immediately. They're not what folklore suggests. Soviet research from the 60s, classified until now, confirms cognitive capabilities exceeding problem-solving parameters. They're watching the roads. Use water routes if possible. Nightfall is when they..." The transmission cut off abruptly, replaced by a different sound. A perfect mimicry of Nakamura's voice, but speaking words the professor would never use. "Come to us, Daniel. We've been waiting for someone like you. Someone who understands." Dawn broke with eerie silence. No birdsong, no rustling leaves, not even the whisper of wind through the pine needles. I emerged from my tent, rifle ready, surveying the clearing with bloodshot eyes. Sleep had been impossible after the radio transmission and its disturbing conclusion. The stone figure remained where it had rolled onto my sleeping bag, its crude features somehow more unsettling in daylight. I photographed it from multiple angles, noting the precision of certain cuts that suggested tools more sophisticated than simple stone implements. Around the perimeter of my camp, a perfect circle of broken pine branches had been laid during the night, each pointing inward toward my tent. The pattern was undeniably deliberate, a boundary of some kind. Whether it represented protection or containment, I couldn't determine. My grandfather's journal offered no insight into this specific behavior, but his final pages contained a hand-drawn map that hadn't made sense until now. What I'd taken for random markings clearly indicated territories and boundaries across the Mackenzie Lake region. According to his notations, I was now deep within what he labeled as central gathering grounds, the heart of their territory. The implications were staggering. If correct, this wasn't just about a single creature or even a small family group. This suggested a complex social structure with defined territories and potentially a population far larger than anyone had suspected. I broke camp with methodical efficiency, packing only what was essential for rapid travel. The logging road remained my best hope for evacuation, but Nakamura's broken transmission had mentioned water routes. I studied my map, noting a stream that flowed southeast from Mackenzie Lake, eventually joining a river system that would lead to inhabited areas. It meant abandoning my original path and traveling through completely unfamiliar terrain, but the alternative was facing whatever waited along the more direct route through the forest. "Water routes," I murmured, recalling my grandfather's warning. "Stay away from water. They use it." Two contradictory warnings. Someone was wrong, or deliberately misleading me. I shouldered my pack and stepped carefully over the circle of pine branches, half expecting some reaction. The forest remained unnaturally still, but the feeling of being watched had intensified. Without my kayak, following the stream meant traveling along its banks, exposed and vulnerable. The first kilometer passed without incident. The stream widened gradually, flowing with surprising force through the rocky terrain. I documented everything: odd arrangements of stones along the banks, unusual breaks in vegetation patterns, a series of scratches on trees that formed no pattern I recognized from known wildlife. At a bend where the stream widened into a small pool, I discovered the first clear evidence I wasn't alone. Half submerged in the shallows lay what remained of my kayak, methodically disassembled. The aluminum frame had been separated from the canvas shell, each piece laid out in precise order of size. More disturbing were the additions: intricate bindings of woven plant fibers securing wooden extensions to the frame, transforming it into something that resembled a primitive trap or cage. The craftsmanship was undeniable, showing not just intelligence but sophisticated understanding of materials and structural engineering. I photographed everything, struggling to maintain scientific detachment. This wasn't random destruction or animal curiosity. This was methodical repurposing, technology being adapted by a non-human intelligence. The stones came without warning, not thrown directly at me, but landing with precision in a semicircle about 5 meters ahead, blocking my progress along the stream bank. I froze, scanning the forest and opposite shore. Nothing moved, yet I could feel multiple presences, coordinating their actions with tactical precision. From upstream came a series of vocalizations, low, rumbling calls that modulated in complex patterns. They were answered from downstream by higher-pitched rapid responses. I recognized the structure from recordings my grandfather had meticulously documented. Not random animal sounds, but communication with syntax and meaning. They were coordinating, herding me. I had two choices: retreat into the forest, away from the water but potentially into a prepared ambush, or continue forward into whatever they were directing me toward. Neither option promised safety. I chose a third path. Dropping my pack on the shore, I waded into the stream itself, gasping as the cold water reached my thighs. If they used water roots, as my grandfather claimed, perhaps direct confrontation in their element would demonstrate I wasn't easily intimidated. The reaction was immediate. The forest erupted with alarm calls, harsh barking vocalizations that echoed across the water. Trees shook as massive bodies moved rapidly through the undergrowth, converging on my position. "I'm not your enemy!" I shouted, raising empty hands above my head. "I want to understand." From the densest section of forest across the stream, something emerged. Not fully into the open, but enough that I caught my first clear glimpse of what had been stalking me. Over 7 feet tall, its massive frame covered in dark reddish-brown hair, standing upright with an unmistakably hominid posture. What struck me most weren't the physical dimensions, impressive as they were, but the eyes, deep-set beneath a heavy brow ridge, reflecting an intelligence that evaluated me with unmistakable calculation. Our gazes locked for perhaps 3 seconds before it melted back into the forest with astonishing silence for its size. In those brief moments, I recognized something that shook me to my core. Not fear or aggression, but recognition. It knew exactly what I was, and more disturbingly, seemed to know why I was there. A splash upstream drew my attention. A crude raft of bound logs was floating toward me, guided by the current. Atop it lay my missing satellite phone, GPS unit, and the memory cards from my cameras, all arranged with deliberate care. The message was unmistakable. An exchange. My technology for what? Safe passage? The water around me suddenly felt dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with current or depth. I waded quickly back to shore, heart pounding. As I reached for my backpack, I noticed it had been moved, slightly repositioned and partially opened. Inside, my grandfather's journal was gone, replaced by another stone figure, larger and more elaborately carved than the first. This one depicted not a single form but a pair, one clearly representing a human, the other the creature I'd glimpsed. Between them was a carved divot containing 3 small white objects. Human teeth. I staggered back, nearly falling into the stream. The forest had gone completely silent again, the oppressive stillness broken only by my ragged breathing. From all around came the soft sounds of movement, not retreating this time, but closing in with deliberate purpose. They'd made their decision about me, just as they'd made their decision about my grandfather 50 years before. I ran. Night fell as I pushed through dense underbrush, lungs burning, legs leaden with exhaustion. I'd abandoned the stream hours ago, navigating by compass alone after discovering my map missing from my pack, another calculated move to disorient me. Without landmarks I recognized, I could only maintain a southeast heading and hope it would eventually lead to civilization. Each time I stopped to rest, the forest around me went silent, only to erupt with movement once I resumed my journey. They weren't pursuing so much as herding, steering me along a path of their choosing. Twice I'd attempted to double back or change direction, only to find my way blocked by strategically positioned obstacles. Fallen trees too precisely placed to be natural, rock formations that hadn't been there minutes before. As full darkness descended, I was forced to make camp in a small depression beneath an outcropping of rock. Without my tent, lost somewhere during the frantic flight, I constructed a rudimentary shelter from pine boughs, creating the illusion of protection more than any actual security. I inventoried what remained of my supplies: half a liter of water, 2 protein bars, my hunting knife, a small first aid kit, and the Winchester rifle with 17 remaining rounds. My cameras were gone, as was most of my specialized equipment. The satellite beacon had disappeared from my pack, eliminating any hope of summoning rescue. Most disturbing was the discovery that the stone figure with human teeth had somehow made its way back into my pack despite my having discarded it during my flight. Someone, something, had been close enough to replace it without my awareness. As I huddled in my makeshift shelter, the darkness around me came alive with sound. Not the normal nocturnal chorus of the forest, but deliberate communications. From the ridge above came a series of low, rumbling calls, answered from the valley below by higher-pitched responses. They were coordinating, positioning themselves strategically around my location. I checked the rifle for the dozenth time, knowing that if they decided to rush my position, 17 rounds would mean nothing against their numbers. My grandfather's final journal entries haunted me. They've made their decision about me. Had they decided I was a threat to be eliminated? Or was I being tested, evaluated against some criteria I couldn't begin to comprehend? Sleep came in microbursts, consciousness fading for seconds rather than minutes or hours. Each time I jerked awake, something had changed in my immediate surroundings. Small arrangements of twigs and patterns too precise to be random. Stones placed in sequential order of size. Once even my water bottle moved from one side of the shelter to the other. They were studying me, just as I had come to study them. As false dawn lightened the eastern sky, I became aware of a new presence. Not the intimidating surveillance of the previous night, but something more focused, more singular. I raised the rifle, peering through the gloom at a figure silhouetted against the gray light. Human. A man of late middle age, dressed in worn outdoor clothing that had seen hard use. He stood perfectly still, observing my shelter with an unnerving calm that matched the creatures themselves. "Daniel Mercer," he said, voice rough from disuse. "You look like him, your grandfather." I tightened my grip on the rifle. "Who are you?" "Someone who made a different choice." He approached slowly, hands visible and empty. "They call me Walker. At least that's how I translate it." As he drew closer, I could see his face clearly, weathered by decades of exposure, deeply lined, with eyes that reflected something between serenity and resignation. What struck me most was the precise arrangement of scars along his jawline and forehead, deliberate markings that formed patterns similar to those I'd seen on trees throughout the forest. "You live with them," I said, comprehension dawning. "You're why they understand our technology." Walker nodded, settling himself on a rock opposite my shelter. "I was a graduate student when I first came here in '86. Biological anthropology. I'd heard rumors about your grandfather's research after his death. The university dismissed it, but I recognized the methodology. He wasn't delusional." "What happened to him?" I asked, the question that had driven my return to these forests. "He discovered too much, too quickly. Pushed for contact before understanding their social structures." Walker's eyes grew distant. "They're not a single homogeneous group, Daniel. There are factions, lineages, complex political structures. Some believe humans should be studied from a distance. Others view us as an existential threat to be eliminated. Still others see potential for exchange. And which faction has been stalking me for the past 2 days?" "All of them," he said simply. "Your presence has forced a decision they've been avoiding for generations. Your grandfather began it, but you, carrying his blood, his research, you represent something symbolic to them." From the forest behind Walker came a low, rumbling vocalization. He responded without turning, producing sounds no human throat should naturally create. The exchange continued for nearly a minute before he turned back to me. "They're offering you the same choice they offered me 38 years ago," he said, expression grave. "Leave now, destroy all records of your encounter, never return, or stay and learn. But staying means never returning to human society. The knowledge they possess, what they are, how they've remained hidden, it cannot spread. And if I refuse both options," Walker's face remained impassive, "then you won't leave these woods at all." I studied him, noting the subtle changes in his posture and movements, the way he shifted his weight like something far larger than a human, the careful precision of his gestures that matched what I'd observed in the glimpses of my stalkers. "How many of you are there?" I asked. "Humans who've chosen to stay?" 17 living, spread across North America. Most much older than me. They rarely extend the invitation." His expression softened slightly. "Your grandfather would have been among us, but he couldn't leave your grandmother, your mother. Family bonds they understood, respected. It's why they allowed him to leave with his life, if not his research." From the forest came another call, more urgent. Walker stood. "Dawn comes soon. They don't meet in open daylight, not for this. Your answer, Daniel Mercer." The weight of the decision pressed down on me like a physical force. Everything I'd worked toward, my career, my relationships, my identity in human society, against knowledge no other scientist had ever accessed, understanding that would rewrite anthropological history. "If I stay," I said slowly, "could I ever send word to my family? Let them know I'm alive at least?" Walker's expression held genuine sympathy. "No, the separation must be absolute. To them, you'll be another wilderness disappearance, another mystery. It's the only way to maintain the balance." I thought of my sparse apartment in Toronto, my colleagues at the university, the few friends who might notice my absence. Then I thought of my grandfather's eyes in the old photographs, the haunted knowledge they held, the questions that had driven him back to these forests again and again. "I need to understand one thing first," I said. "What are they? Not folklore, not myth. Scientifically." Walker looked toward the lightening sky, then back to me. For the first time, I saw something like pride in his expression. "They were here first, Daniel. Long before Homo sapiens crossed from Asia. A parallel branch of evolution that developed different adaptations, different social structures. Not Neanderthal, not Denisovan, something parallel. They watched us build cities, develop technology, spread across the continent. And they made a collective decision to remain apart, to guard their existence through deliberate myth-making. The implications staggered me. And they allow humans like you, like us, to join them? Why? Genetic diversity, cultural exchange, and... He hesitated. Insurance. If humanity ever discovered them en masse, they wanted individuals who could translate, negotiate. They're preparing for a future where hiding may no longer be possible. Dawn had broken fully now, golden light spilling through the trees. Walker extended his hand. Your answer, Daniel. They're waiting. The first snow of winter fell softly through the pines, individual flakes catching the morning light like microscopic prisms. I adjusted my position on the rocky outcropping, focusing my handcrafted telescope on the distant highway. Through the lens, I could make out the flashing lights of search vehicles, the third major effort in the 5 months since my disappearance. Behind me, Kasha made a soft vocalization, a question about the time. I responded without turning, my throat now capable of approximating their complex language after months of intensive training. She settled beside me, her massive frame dwarfing mine despite her being considered small among her kind. They will not find anything, she said in carefully practiced English. Our exchanges alternated between languages, my learning theirs, her perfecting ours. The evidence is gone. I nodded, thinking of the elaborate efforts they'd made to eliminate all traces of my presence. My camp had been disassembled, components scattered across 50 kilometers of wilderness. My vehicle had been driven to a ravine in Quebec, carefully staged to suggest an accident or intentional disappearance. Even my scent trails had been methodically obscured using techniques that demonstrated their profound understanding of human tracking methods. The official search had been downgraded from missing person to presumed deceased after the discovery of blood evidence. My blood, harvested during my integration ceremony and strategically placed to suggest a wildlife attack. Your family grieves, Kasha said, her deep-set eyes studying my expression with the penetrating intelligence that still unsettled me after months of daily contact. This troubles you. It wasn't a question. Their species, which I now knew called themselves something that roughly translated as the first people, possessed emotional perception far exceeding human capabilities. They detected minute changes in body temperature, scent markers, and micro-expressions that made deception virtually impossible. Yes, I admitted. My mother will never know what happened to me, like she never knew the truth about her father. Kasha made a low rumbling sound, their expression of empathy. The separation protects them as much as us. Knowledge brings danger. I had learned the truth of this statement during my integration. The history of interaction between their kind and humans stretched back thousands of years, documented in their oral traditions with precise detail. Early encounters had often ended in violence, leading to their deliberate strategy of cultivating folklore and myth as camouflage. What humans dismissed as superstition, Sasquatch, Wendigo, the wild men of the woods, served as perfect concealment. When evidence occasionally emerged, it was discredited by its association with these legends. The rare human witnesses who persisted too loudly in their claims tended to disappear, their evidence with them. Walker comes, Kasha said, rising to her full height of nearly 8 feet. Against the snow-covered landscape, her reddish-brown hair appeared almost black, a stark contrast to the lighter facial coloration that distinguished females of her lineage. I followed her gaze to the forest below, where Walker emerged from the tree line. In the months since our first meeting, I'd learned his true history. How he'd been chosen for integration after accidentally photographing a family group in 1986. How he'd served as intermediary during rare instances when hikers or researchers strayed too close to sensitive territories. He climbed the slope with the fluid efficiency he'd adopted from his hosts, a blend of human and non-human movement patterns that I was slowly learning to replicate. The council has reached a decision, he announced without preamble. Your request has been approved. My heart raced. For weeks, I'd been advocating for a revolutionary proposal. Controlled, limited evidence released to select human scientists. Nothing definitive, nothing irrefutable, but enough to redirect research into evolutionary history along more accurate paths. All of it? I asked, scarcely believing my success. Modified terms, Walker clarified. No photographs, no DNA samples. Only your written observations, structured as theoretical scholarship based on indigenous oral histories. Publication through your grandfather's former colleague at the University of British Columbia. It was less than I'd hoped, but more than I'd expected. The council, consisting of elder representatives from 7 major lineages, maintained rigid protocols about human interaction. That they'd agreed to any information release represented unprecedented progress. When? I asked. The winter gathering, after final approval from all lineages. Walker turned to Kasha. The Sister Lakes community has concerns about specific details. They request your lineage's intervention. Kasha made a gesture of acknowledgement, a complex movement involving both hands that conveyed respect, obligation, and mild frustration simultaneously. The political dynamics between lineages remained largely opaque to me, though I was learning to recognize the patterns of alliance and opposition. As they discussed the diplomatic nuances in their native language, too rapid and complex for my developing comprehension, I turned back to my telescope, focusing again on the distant search vehicles. A pang of genuine grief hit me as I imagined my mother receiving updates from the provincial police, hoping for closure that would never truly come. The irony wasn't lost on me. I had come to these woods seeking evidence of an undiscovered species, driven by my grandfather's mysterious legacy. Instead, I had discovered an entire parallel society, not merely surviving alongside human civilization, but actively managing human awareness through generations of calculated intervention. Their technological development had followed entirely different paths from humanity's. While they possessed nothing resembling electronics or modern machinery, their understanding of botanical compounds, weather patterns, and ecosystem management far surpassed contemporary human science. Their linguistic capabilities included communication methods beyond human auditory range, explaining how they coordinated complex movements without visible signals. Most humbling was their historical knowledge, oral traditions maintained with such precision that they could describe climate conditions from 12,000 years ago, the arrival of the first human bands across the Bering Land Bridge, the rise and fall of indigenous nations long before European contact. Walker and Kasha concluded their discussion and turned to me. "It's time," Walker said. "The northern bands are gathering. 3 days' journey." I nodded, making a final adjustment to my telescope before carefully packing it away. This would be my first major gathering, representatives from lineages across the continent converging for the winter conclave. According to Walker, fewer than 10 humans had ever witnessed such an event in recorded history. As we descended the ridge, Keisha moved ahead with characteristic grace despite her size, identifying the path that would keep us concealed from any distant observers. Walker fell into step beside me. "You still doubt your choice," he said. Not a question, but an observation. "Not doubt," I clarified. "Adjustment. Everything I knew about evolutionary history, about human uniqueness, is incomplete," he finished. "Not wrong, just missing crucial chapters. Your grandfather understood this. It's why they respected him, despite their disagreements." We walked in silence for several minutes, the snow deepening around us. Ahead, Kasha paused at a stream crossing, surveying the opposite bank with practiced caution before proceeding. "Will they ever reveal themselves fully?" I asked. "If human development continues to encroach on their territories, their isolation becomes increasingly difficult to maintain." Walker's expression grew distant, thoughtful. They've survived ice ages, megafauna extinctions, the European colonization, and the Industrial Revolution, each time adapting, retreating when necessary, eliminating threats when required. They think in generational timescales we can barely comprehend. That's not an answer, I pressed. He smiled slightly. They have contingency plans, multiple scenarios developed over centuries. Some involve controlled revelation under specific conditions. Others, he hesitated, are less optimistic about human reaction. I thought of the stone figure with human teeth, the warning it represented. Despite months of integration, despite being accepted into daily life with Kasha's family group, I remained acutely aware of the current beneath the surface, the factions Walker had mentioned during our first meeting, those who viewed humanity as an existential threat to be managed rather than engaged. Ahead, Kasha had stopped again, her posture alert. She made a short, sharp vocalization that raised the hair on my neck, a warning call I'd learned to recognize. Walker immediately moved to a defensive position, scanning the forest with practiced efficiency. "What is it?" I whispered, instinctively reaching for the stone knife I now carried at my waist, a gift from Kasha's lineage elder, marking my acceptance into their extended family structure. "Humans," Walker replied tersely. "Not search teams. Hunters. Too close to the gathering route." Kasha made another sound, a question about intervention. Walker responded with a complex series of vocalizations that I interpreted as a debate about options. I caught references to boundary markers and deterrence protocols. The decision came quickly. Kasha melted into the forest with astonishing silence for her size, heading toward the hunter's position. Walker turned to me. "This is your test," he said quietly. "The Council wants to observe your response to human proximity. Your loyalty remains under evaluation." I understood the implications immediately. How I acted in the next few minutes would determine my status within their society, and possibly whether my information release would be approved. After 5 months of integration, I was still not fully trusted. With good reason, perhaps. The pull of human contact, of returning to my former life, remained powerful despite everything I'd learned and experienced. The hunters represented a potential link to that world, people who could carry word of my survival, end my mother's grief, restore my human connections, all at the cost of betraying those who had shared their existence with me. I made my decision. 20 minutes later, we continued our journey northward. Behind us, the hunters were already returning to their vehicles, thoroughly convinced that the sudden equipment failures, disorienting trail markers, and unsettling vocalizations from all directions indicated they had strayed into territory better left unexplored. They would return with another story of unexplained wilderness experiences, another contribution to the folklore that had protected the first people for millennia. Their report would join thousands of similar accounts, dismissed by science, preserved in campfire stories and internet forums, maintaining the protective shroud of implausibility that remained the most effective camouflage in an age of ubiquitous technology. As we crossed into deeper wilderness, beyond any human trails or monitoring systems, Kasha dropped back to walk beside me. Without words, she extended her massive hand, palm up, a gesture of approval and acceptance I had earned through my choice. I placed my hand on hers, feeling the immense strength carefully restrained. Ahead lay the gathering of the first people, and my formal presentation to their full council. Behind us, the last traces of my human life vanished beneath the steadily falling snow, covering our tracks in ways both literal and symbolic. I had crossed a boundary few humans had ever approached. Not just a physical territory, but a threshold of understanding about our species' place in evolutionary history. One of several intelligent hominids that had competed, coexisted, and occasionally interbred across hundreds of thousands of years. The snow continued to fall as we moved deeper into their world, erasing the boundary between what was known and what remained hidden in the whispers of the pines.